Adana stood by the river, and the village stopped to watch. It happened every morning. She was not a person to them, but a landmark, as fixed and unmoving as the stone bridge spanning the water. Her presence acted as a magnet, drawing eyes from the market stalls and the doorways of homes. She felt the weight of those gazes like physical pressure against her skin, a constant, silent demand for her to remain exactly as they expected. This beauty was a thief. It broke into her life and stole the autonomy she craved, replacing her name with a title based on a face she did not choose to possess. She would turn to walk toward the forest, and the path would be blocked by a group of men pretending to ask for water, their eyes lingering on her features, while their words drifted into empty air. They did not see the hands that could work or the feet that could run. They saw a prize. They saw an object to be collected. Every day, the village grew smaller, the walls of the valley tighter, and the life she might have led slipped further into the shadows of the expectations that held her captive. When the village was quiet, Adana fled to the riverbanks where the silt turned to thick, dark mud. Here, the gazes could not reach her. She knelt, her fingers probing the damp earth for the roots that only she knew how to identify. She crushed a leaf between her palms, inhaling the sharp, bitter scent of sage and willow bark. This was her true work. While the village saw a face, she saw the currents that could carry a raft toward the northern markets. She traced the flow of the water, calculating the speed of the eddies against the jagged rocks downstream. If she could map the river, she could leave. She spent hours documenting the medicinal properties of the forest floor, marking the location of every rare herb in a scrap of parchment hidden beneath a flat stone. Her mind was a ledger of variables, temperatures, and healing ratios. She did not want to be a landmark. She wanted to be a traveler, a woman of science and survival. Every route she cataloged felt like a step toward an exit. She looked at the horizon, past the valley, where the mountains bled into the northern haze. She was building a map to a life that belonged only to her, even if she had to keep it buried in the dirt to survive. Adana stepped out of the tree line and stopped. The village square, usually a place of casual gossip, had become a staging ground. Two men waited near her home, their horses restless, kicking up dust that hung heavy in the heat. The first was a trader. He did not look at her face. He looked at her potential value. He laid out rolls of fabric and silver coins on a wooden crate, his voice loud as he spoke of trade routes and luxury. He treated her like a rare commodity to be shipped and stored in a gilded vault. Beside him stood the warrior. He rested his hand on his weapon, his eyes scanning the perimeter as if the world were a battlefield. He offered safety, but it was a heavy, suffocating kind. He spoke of walls and guards, his version of protection sounding exactly like a locked door. Adana watched as her father stepped forward, his eyes bright with the promise of status. He did not ask what she wanted. He began counting the coins. The air in the square felt thin, the space around her shrinking with every word they spoke. They were not inviting her to a life. They were negotiating the terms of her confinement. She stood still, her hands balled into fists, realizing that to them, she was already sold. The heavy silence of the square was broken by a soft, rhythmic step. A man moved from the back of the crowd, his boots dusty from the fields. He did not bring silver, nor did he boast of protection. He stopped a respectful distance away, his gaze settling not on her face, but on her eyes. The trader and the warrior fell silent, confused by his lack of posturing. He looked toward the river, then back to her. "I saw you near the reeds yesterday," he said, his voice steady and low. "You were studying the water's path near the white stones. Tell me, do you think the current will hold if the rains come early this season?" Adana blinked. The tension in her shoulders loosened. For the first time in years, someone had bypassed the surface. He was not asking for a prize, he was asking for her mind. She stepped forward, her voice gaining strength as she spoke of the river's depth and the way the sediment shifted after a storm. They talked of soil, of seasonal patterns, and of the hidden geography of the forest. The trader shifted, impatient, and the warrior frowned, but Adana did not look at them. She was engaged in a conversation that acknowledged she was a person with thoughts, experiences, and a future of her own design. The conversation ended, but the silence that followed was sharp. Adana turned to her father, her posture resolute. She spoke clearly, naming the farmer as her choice. The square went still, the trader sneered, and the warrior shifted his weight, but the true coldness came from her father. He did not look at her as a daughter. He looked at her as a failed investment. He slammed his hand against the wooden table, the sound echoing against the nearby huts. He refused. He dismissed the farmer with a wave of his hand, calling the choice a waste of potential. To him, the farmer brought no status, no leverage, and no increase in his own standing. He listed the trader's riches and the warrior's influence, his voice rising, demanding that she accept the higher offer. Adana stepped back, her breath catching in her throat. She looked at him and saw only a man counting coins. She realized then that her face was not hers. It was a wall built between her and the world. She was trapped by the very thing they all coveted. She turned away, ignoring his shouting, and walked toward the edge of the village. The weight of her own features felt heavier than stone. Every step away from them was a step deeper into the realization that her existence had been reduced to a prize, and she was currently its prisoner. Adana left the village behind, her pace quickening until she reached the bank where the forest met the water. She collapsed onto the damp earth, her lungs burning from the exertion of her flight. She needed the river. It was the only place that did not demand anything from her. But as she knelt, the world began to change. The wind that usually stirred the reeds died in a single heartbeat. The insects stopped their rhythmic clicking. The water, which usually rushed and tumbled over the jagged stones, smoothed out until it looked like a sheet of hammered silver. It was not just quiet, it was a vacuum of sound. She reached down to splash her face, but the surface did not break. It held firm, thick as oil. She pulled her hands back, heart hammering against her ribs. The air grew heavy, pressing down on her shoulders. Then, a vibration began in the mud beneath her knees. It traveled up through her limbs, a low, melodic thrumming that felt like speech without words. She stared into the center of the pool, where a dark shape began to rise from the depths. The water rippled outward in perfect concentric circles. A voice, sounding like grinding stones and rushing silt, emerged from the stillness. It did not come from the air, it came from the water itself. The figure broke the surface, a shifting mass of silt and moonlight. It did not have a face, yet Adana felt a gaze that saw through her skin to the exhaustion beneath. The voice resonated in her chest, a cold demand for the price of her freedom. It spoke of the weight she carried, the way men looked at her and saw only an object to be possessed. The Spim offered a trade. It would strip away the features that made her a landmark, the magnetism that tethered her to the whims of her father and the suitors. In exchange, she would become invisible to those who sought to own her. She would walk through the world unbothered, her mind her own, her path hers to carve. Adana looked at the dark water, then at the forest where her life had been dictated by the gazes of others. She thought of the farmer, the only man who had ever asked for her thoughts instead of her presence. She did not hesitate. She reached out, pressing her palms against the frigid, still surface of the river. "Take it," she whispered. The water surged upward, wrapping around her wrists like chains of ice, pulling the heat from her skin and the very essence of her face into the deep. The sun hit her eyelids, sharp and unyielding. Adana sat up on the riverbank, the damp earth clinging to her skin. She reached for the water to wash the grit from her face, but her hands stopped halfway. The surface was no longer a mirror of magic. It was just water. She leaned closer. The high arch of her brow had leveled. The curve of her cheek had softened into something unremarkable. The magnetism that had defined every movement of her life was gone. She stood, brushing off the dirt, and felt a strange, hollow lightness in her chest. She walked back toward the village, her feet finding the familiar path. A group of men stood near the center well, talking in hushed tones. Usually, their eyes would lock onto her before she was even 10 paces away. She walked right past them. They did not turn. They did not lower their voices. They did not stop their work to watch her progress. She kept walking, her heart rate steady, her breathing even. For the first time, the space around her felt entirely her own. She was not a prize to be tracked or a landmark to be claimed. She was simply a person walking under the morning sun, completely, blissfully ignored by the world. The father watched her approach the house, his eyes sliding over her as if she were nothing more than a passing breeze. When the farmer stood by her side, the father no longer saw an opportunity for status or wealth. He saw only a union of little consequence. He nodded his consent without a word, turning back to his own business. Adana did not linger. She and the farmer were wed in a quiet ceremony under the trees, witnessed only by those who cared for them as neighbors. The days that followed were filled with the scent of dried herbs and the damp weight of medical texts. She spent hours in the forest, learning the properties of roots and leaves, mapping the healing properties of the earth. She was no longer a prize to be displayed, but a student of the world. With the harvest gathered and their small home packed into crates, they turned toward the northern horizon. The road was long and the climate grew harsh, but she walked with a steady stride, her mind fixed on the markets and the hospitals of the north. She had traded her reflection for a future, and as the village faded into the dust behind them, she finally felt the road belonged to her feet. Decades later, the northern air bit at her skin, but Adana moved with the same steady purpose she had carried since she left the river. She sat on the porch, her fingers tracing the rough, calloused maps etched into her palms. Her grandchildren gathered at her feet, watching the way her hands moved as she sorted through dried medicinal roots. One child reached out, touching the thick skin of her thumb. Adana smiled, pulling the child closer. She spoke of the river, not as a place of loss, but as the site of her greatest liberation. She told them that for a single season, she had mourned the face the world had once obsessed over. But that grief had withered like a dead leaf, replaced by the weight of her own choices. She held up her hands, showing the scars and the hardening of the skin. These were not marks of a prize, but of a life lived by her own design. She told them that being looked at was a hollow existence, a cage built by the eyes of others. Being truly seen required the courage to be ordinary, to be flawed, and to be entirely, undeniably human. The river had taken a gift she never owned and returned the ownership of her days to her own hands. She looked toward the horizon, and for the first time, there was nothing left to trade.